Revelations in the ongoing murder trial of a 26-year-old Chinese visiting scholar Zhang Yingying in the U.S. have appalled Chinese society and international students in the U.S. The same jury that convicted Brendt Christensen will be brought back for sentencing beginning July the 8th. The sentencing phase will play out much like any other trial, with opening and closing statements from both sides, and the presentation of evidence before the jury makes their decision. Will Brendt Christensen be sentenced to a life sentence or the death penalty? How can we ensure justice in the face of brutality? And what should be done to emphasize campus security, especially for Chinese students in the U.S.? To discuss these and many other issues related to Zhang Yingying's case and more, I'm joined in the studio by Edward Lehman, Managing Director of Lehman, Lee & Xu, Flora Liu, CEO of Joyview Education, and Gary Mao, CEO of Total Express. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Easy question for all of you is, can you brief us on the latest development, Edward?
Sure. The latest development was he was convicted of Brendt Christensen of murder and kidnapping of Zhang Yingying in the Central Court, a federal court in the United States, in Peoria, and of murder and kidnapping. Now he's being brought back for the sentencing phase, so he faces either life imprisonment or the death penalty. And as you said earlier, he was convicted by a jury, which is 12 persons. It was made up of 7 men and 5 women. And these same 12 persons will have to unanimously make a decision whether he will face the death penalty or life imprisonment. And so those are essentially the 2 options. This will be played out much like a trial, like you said. There will be opening and closing statements. The state represents Zhang Yingying, and the defense, obviously, the defendant, Brendt Christensen. And this is actually going to be what we call the battle of the experts in order to understand whether he should be executed or spend his life in prison.
Flora, now that Brendt Christensen has pleaded guilty with the convincing substantial evidence presented by the prosecutors, what are your current concerns about the case of Zhang Yingying at this moment?
My biggest concern is the emotional well-being of the victims' families, because the harms have already been done to Zhang Yingying. Nothing can bring her back to life again. But I'm a little concerned that the media is re-victimizing the victims' families by making this very sensational. And also, I believe that Zhang Yingying's families are suffering from PTSD. I hope that professional consultants would offer them treatment so that they can back to normal life again.
Gary, your concerns?
I'm just wondering, like, why does this second phase exist at all? Like, why are they even dragging this out to talk death or life, right? Like, are their parents even involved in this decision? Like, are they just, sitting there waiting for America to kind of rule on the outcome of something that, they don't belong as a citizen to? Like, why does this exist?
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to Gary's point, I mean, from a legal perspective, we have something that's instituted in the United States called due process, and so everyone is allowed to face their accuser. The state is the one who's put Brendt Christensen, has made the decision, is prosecuting him. In this particular case, in the second stage, which is the sentencing phase, the parents do have a chance to say how much this has impacted their lives through a translator or directly themselves. And this second part is supposed to be along the lines of not only showing some level of justice, but also that justice is transparent and it is being done and considered and weighed thoughtfully.
Defining moment of the whole process about whether Brendt will be brought to justice will come when whether a life sentence or the death penalty should be announced by the judge. Now, what do you think are the major elements that will give Brendt the death penalty or the life sentence? I mean, what are the major things that will prevent the judge or the jury from granting him the verdict of the death penalty.
Sure. So we have to unpack this a little bit. In 1967, the United States Supreme Court decided that the death penalty should be abolished. In 1976, they said we should bring it back. So that's what they did in 1976. Typically, in the state of Illinois, the death penalty has been abolished. This is brought in federal court. It's very confusing, but this is brought in federal court on federal charges that the death penalty should be instituted. It was brought specifically by the prosecutors so that they could bring the death penalty in this particular case. Now, in the United States, about 64%, when the options are between death penalty and life imprisonment, 64% have voted for life imprisonment over the death penalty. Because this is a federal case and because of the way the statutes are written, it has to be grievous, which would include sexual abuse that happened to the victim, or torture, or some kind of very large aggravating circumstance. They do have it here because he was convicted both of kidnapping, which is one of the aggravating extensions, and murder, of course. But the likelihood probably of her, in my estimation, statistically getting the death penalty is probably around the 36% factor, because they had to prove aggravating factors, and because they didn't have proof of torture, they didn't have proof, although that probably did occur, that isn't being submitted. Remember, it's only what goes into the jury as evidence, what the judge permits as evidence to be heard by the trial. So, for example, in the O.J. Simpson case, a lot of evidence was not permitted by the judge to be heard by the jury, and they came out with a decision that said he was not guilty. A lot of people didn't believe in that. And so, like I said, in this particular phase, they've got to prove those aggravating circumstances under the federal rules, not under the state rules, because it's been abolished in the state of Illinois, to be able to sentence him to death.
So then, when they said the FBI did the wiretap, and then they had him saying he tortured her, like, was that not admissible? Was that, like, how was that treated?
Precisely, and that's the question of whether that comes in under the evidence rules. Now, that had not been permitted. Now the question is whether that's going to be permitted by the judge during this sentencing phase. So sometimes the sentencing, I mean, to answer Gary's question earlier, sometimes the sentencing comes directly after the verdict comes out. In this particular case, because they're bringing in the University of Illinois, they're bringing in health sciences, because of this, exactly what Gary said, there was wiretapping where he was admitting to his ex-wife certain things, or whether the evidence could come in from the counselor from the University of Illinois where he was suicidal, whether that should be in or should be prejudicial. That prejudicial would say not to give.
And we'll talk hours about American legal system. Very complicated, very sophisticated.
Yeah. Thank goodness for lawyers.
Definitely, by so many cases, not only through Hollywood movies, but by media reports on a case like Zhang Yingying. Flora, at this moment, do you think you are concerned more with the death penalty or life imprisonment, or you would rather care more about the safety of Chinese students, or whether the remains of Zhang Yingying could be discovered and brought back so that it could be something that will satisfy the parents' last wish?
I think Christensen will die for sure. It's a matter of whether he died in prison alone with a bunch of strangers or die at a day when the government chooses. That I don't worry about. What I'm concerned is that this case has disappointed a lot of Chinese parents who plan to send their kids abroad, because Joy V Education are providing counseling services to potential college students to the U.S. And I've heard a lot of Chinese parents are worried that their kids could have potential risks in the U.S. and they're even considering change their destination to a different country. That's what I'm concerned about. And also, I'm a little concerned, like I said before, the emotional well-being of Zhang Yingying's families, especially recently, their videos of telling Yingying stories and showing her singing went viral on the internet. I'm just a little concerned after the trial is closed, whether they're able to back to their normal life again.
For so many Chinese students who are either back or who apply for an opportunity in the United States, they consider the United States a dreamland. They would consider a 4-year study in the United States a dream opportunity, a nice key to the paradise. they would never ever consider the United States a dangerous place. So Gary and Flora, why the United States turns out to be one of the most dangerous places for international students? I mean, this kind of a stereotyped perception has very much been shaped by the media reports about, violent murders, violent crimes, raping, kidnapping, gun-related violence, so on and so forth. Gary, first of all, you're an ABC. You were born and grew up in the United States. Do you think this stereotyped perception will pervade the awareness of Chinese parents, students, or you think this is a prejudice that needs to be corrected? What are your thoughts on the United States being a safe land for international students, or you would rather argue the other way around?
Well, I would say for one thing, America has a great marketing team behind it that made this image of safety, right? They built this notion of the American dream, the white picket fence, everything's so clean and functional. But the reality, right? Like, I mean, as this Zhang Yingying instance was horrendous, right? And by no means am I saying that this happens all the time. But other things like sexual misconduct, drug abuse, things like that, this will happen in every single college campus, like around America, right? And I don't see, when I'm in China, I don't see people discuss that, right? But I would imagine that if you want to go after a great education, which it still provides in America, you need to also be aware of those things too, right? So
what would be the first concern you would come up with should you send your kid from China to the United States? What would be the very first concern on your mind when you are supposed to brief him about the security regulations, laws, and dangers that might be very serious to him or her?
I think that I guess it would depend on where they're going. If they're, not where, but at what stage. If they're going to
you mean location of the universities means a lot?
No. I just mean like if they're going to come in as a college student, right? Because as a college student, you're going to face a lot of things like parties, how to act and how to behave to not get exploited, to want to fit in with the crowd and do drugs just so you want to fit in, or to leave your drink unattended, which maybe is something that as a high schooler in China maybe has never been faced before, right? But the risk of doing these things, which as an ABC, as an American, frankly, like I've grown up knowing these things, like don't do this at a bar, don't do that. When somebody tells you this, don't listen to them because it's too risky, right? But I imagine that kind of training, that input doesn't really exist at the high school level here. That's what I would warn them about.
Yeah, I'm a little bit concerned about that too, because all Chinese students do in high school is preparing for SAT, AP history. They have no time to think about the potential risks they will encounter in the U.S. college. That's why last year we designed a program for students like that, preparing them culturally and academically for the U.S. universities, and we hired someone from the West Point Academy to teach them the safety tips and the basic self-defense skills. We think those skills are must learn before they go to the U.S. Because in the past, parents and students, all they care is the ranking of the school. But when they actually have to live in the U.S. for at least 4 years, safety definitely becomes the #1 priority to everyone.
Yeah, no question. And what also the difference is a foreigner living in China, I can pretty much walk anywhere except and not be concerned about violence, cannot be concerned about necessarily theft or any kind of bad activity. My only danger would come from automobiles or bicycles or things running into me. Each and every town, whether it's a small college town in a rural area, has a scary part of town, has a dangerous part of town. And I think the Chinese are going into this belief, because China is a pretty safe place, generally speaking, especially from handguns and violence, that they don't understand that each town has its own sort of bad...
China will become much safer because of the pervasive use of CCTV surveillance cameras, hidden cameras, like the use of face recognition technology. But that's very controversial for Westerners.
Sure.
But do you think this is necessary for the prevention of crimes, particularly violent crimes? As an ABC American, can you accept the use of hidden cameras like face recognition so that students in the streets, pedestrians in the streets would have a much better feeling about safety?
I think that this particular case brings a great example for why maybe more surveillance might be needed, right? Because we are looking in this whole case, right? We're looking at his browsing history, which Americans would say this is private. Never look at my browsing, but we know it, right? they wiretapped him to figure out these things. Conversations should not be public, but we now are upholding these things as a big part of the case.
Also, CCTV cameras had caught him.
Yeah.
I mean, which was a big controversy as well, because there probably weren't enough, because it was a distance away from, and that might have saved her life if they had more CCTV cameras.
Yeah.
One more question about the safety of Chinese girls and women. Because of the use of the CCTV in the campus of Illinois, cops and the FBI were able to see the last moment of Zhang Yingying stepping into an automobile that was driven by Brendt Christensen. I'd like to know more about the stereotype, the perception of Asian women for Westerners. Gary, what kind of image does an Asian girl or woman come across for most of the white boys in the United States?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for her entire race, right? But
you'll give it a go.
But I can say stereotypes that do exist, that I definitively heard mentioned before. Or you can say in media exists, right?
For example, what would have happened to a white American girl when the automobile pulled over and said, and Brandon invited her to come into this and give her a free ride? What would have been the response, immediate response from a white girl who was born and grew up in the United States, right in the state of Illinois, for example?
Well, I would say the primary thing was just somebody that grew up in the United States. I think you know not to go into people's cars, even if they're saying, I'm an undercover policeman. I think that this is like something that I would say a lot of times doesn't really work, because that just doesn't exist so much if you've lived in America. Like, you don't see undercover cops every day pull you into a car. But I would say for me, looking at in China, if somebody presented a feeling of authority, me as a relative foreigner here, I'd be less inclined to think that they were lying to me.
The kidnapping was months of planning for Brandon. Why did he single out an Asian girl, an Asian visiting scholar, a lady? Do you think there is necessarily or inevitably a message implied in his choice of this prey, of this target, Flora?
I'm not Christensen, so I cannot speak on his behalf.
But you have read some of the papers, official papers about this case. Do you like very much the question that I asked Gary, perception of Asian women? Do they, or are they viewed as submissive, obedient, tender, so that they would not resist any sexual harassment, sexual advance?
One thing I do notice is today, before the show, I browsed Christensen's Facebook page, and I realized that he's a big fan of the Japanese cartoons, where women are portrayed as submissive and cute. But to anyone who see Asian women as submissive and an easier target, I would want to kick their ass, because this is not true.
Yeah, I mean, like for me, have I heard people say that before, the submissive thing, even about Asian men? Yes. It's disgusting. You know, like that should just simply not exist, and they're simply wrong. But unfortunately, there are media instances in movies and things like that where that kind of image is portrayed. And I cannot say that that doesn't influence people on an everyday basis when you see it on TV, when you see it on movies.
Okay, let's look at other safety concerns. Eddie, from your perspective, what are the dangers you have to alert the Chinese students and their parents to when it comes to the life of an American university campus?
You know, these are crucibles in which, again, there's an appearance of safety on these places, and I think that the difference is that the tone of Chinese education is to listen to your teachers, is to listen to adults and parents, and certainly someone like Zhang Yingying, who had come there and had just newly arrived, essentially. You know, her idea she didn't have the kind of training that Flora's organization provides, probably where they're told to be wary of those kinds of things. I think that, you know, in a Chinese educational context, from an outsider looking at it, they're always listening to their authorities, they're listening to teachers and trying to follow and obey. with regard to an educational context. And I think you have to think for yourself that not everyone is there with good purpose, and that someone should be able to take a defense class. Also, the idea that the university is supposed to act what they call loco parentis, which means is replacement of your parents. And the question is, has the University of Illinois, and I think that the parents should not only be seeking the death penalty here because that's what they would like, but they should also be seeking civil liability from the university, which should have protected her. It's one thing to be able to take a class like Flora and her organization has and promotes for people, which I think everyone should take. It's another thing that the university should be able to train all those foreign students. The largest place where Chinese students are in the entire United States is the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana.
5,000 of them.
Right, 373,000 are in the United States of the 1 million Chinese that are educated abroad. That it should be mandatory as local parentis, as the universities, to be able to train these Chinese when they do come there. They're paying such an exorbitant amount of money for that. It's not just about the education, but it's about the safety and the ability to have a place where they can be educated. And the Chinese are really too naive to be able to understand this when they come onto these campuses, especially when you're in Champaign, Illinois. It's a very relatively small town, and people think it's a safe place with friendly people, which it is. In this case, it went very, very badly, and she should have known not. She was waiting for a shuttle bus, actually, and then the Brendt Christensen had come along and said, "I'll give you a ride," and she unfortunately took that ride.
And I'll go one step further. I mean, as much as it's great that Flora's company is providing this, it is an absolute travesty that we're talking about having to train the victims to protect themselves from the animals that are going to prey on them, right? Like, they did nothing wrong per se, and it's just like, it's almost like, if this is happening in America, America needs to take ownership of it. They need to protect, if they want to attract the best and brightest to their campuses, they need to protect the students that are working, like hundreds of hours a week to study their butts off to make it here.
Well,
the animal in this case actually sought for help at the counseling center of UIUC. Prior to this case, Christensen actually visited one of the therapists at the counsel center to seek for help. But unfortunately, the therapist said that he could do nothing with this case. And if anything was done before this case, I think the tragedy could have been avoided. So I'm very disappointed at the counseling center of UIUC.
Right. And no, I agree with you, Flora. Exactly what happened in that case, and this is going to be part of what they're calling the mitigating factor. So the defense, his lawyers, are going to use that to say, hey, he had a mental problem. University of Illinois did not flag it. It wasn't his fault because they should have flagged it. So that's kind of a bad thing. On the upside, I mean, what the therapist is saying from the University of Illinois is that because they didn't legally pose a specific threat to a specific person, that they were not obliged to tell that this man had these kind of thoughts. So he had confessed that before at the University of Illinois.
Okay, the last question is very much about what's going to happen to the family, the parents. The mother did not receive very good education, basically just a housewife. The father, an ordinary worker on the construction site. They have lost their loved one. Now the issue remains when and where the remains of Zhang Yingying will be found and she could be brought home. Having said that, what should be done to alleviate the concerns of the family and the parents in particular? Flora, at the very beginning of our interview, raised an issue about the alleged second victimization of the family. What do you mean by that?
Because currently the media are publicizing this case, and the pictures, videos of Zhang Yingying and her families are everywhere. Every Chinese knows about this case, and I think this will pose infringement on Zhang Yingying's family's privacy. And I'm also a little concerned about the emotional well-being of the families. They must be suffering depression, anxieties, and PTSD currently. So I hope that the Chinese government could offer a therapy service to the families, and I also hope that someone from the States could offer therapy to Christensen as well, because a 2014 study shows that a sense of remorse and compassion expressed from the perpetrator towards the victim's families actually help the families to cope with the situation.
Life would not be back to the normal for the family of Zhang Yingying. Meager income of the family would not sustain the life, which is totally traumatized with the killing of Zhang Yingying. So what about the fundraising charity that's been done by student unions and voluntary organizations in the United States? Gary, do you think that could be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually in this kind of period of darkness, I think that this is one silver lining, right? In the sense that we went over this topic of stereotypes, but I think in this case, it's heard loud and clear that when this, Chinese international student suffered great pain, it doesn't matter what race you are, whatever, the American people, the students actually stood up and said, we care. Like, you matter to us. And that's something that, we don't see enough these days, but it's great that...
I think there are many charity organizations, churches that play a very important role in raising funds. Do you think America would make a very big difference?
I do. The one thing that the United States is known for is again, these kind of NGOs, charities, churches, organizations that want to help. And they do help, and they do provide help. The other thing that is available for the family is that they're entitled to, as you remember in the O.J. Simpson trial, he was found innocent, okay? But Ron Goldman, which was the father of one of the slain victims in the case, actually got a $33 million damage award against O.J. Simpson, which then took all of his possessions. The family has the opportunity now to sue in the civil court, okay, that's just over money, and saying, we've lost our breadwinner, we've lost someone who would provide to the society. And not only can they get actual damages that they would suffer, but then punitive damages as well. And those damages could also be against the university for not doing the kind of thing that they probably should have done, which has the very deep pockets, which they should be sued for civilly. And that happened at the Michigan State University when one of the doctors there was seen to abuse students. And I do believe that this is, besides the charity, I also think that the civil award, which will give money to the victims, and I think in this case almost for certain, will be an equitable remedy for that family.
I doubt that Christian would have any money, because I read from the news that he is very broke. But I do hope that UIUC could invest more in building its pre-orientation program for international students. Yes, there is an orientation program for everyone, but I do think that international students deserve more care and specific guidance, since they are studying and spending 4 years in a foreign land.
Right, but just so to have one last thing, just the idea that it can civilly, because they've been negligent, the University of Illinois, by not training people. That's why they would get money.
Well, one most interesting point about the whole case is when and where the remains of Zhang Yingying would be found and should be taken home. Well, that's a lot about the legal system of the United States, which prevents cops from using torture. The efficiency of the investigation has very much been compromised as a result, but that's a very controversial issue. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.